I'm Ed Hamilton. I'm going to talk about Rhum Agricole this afternoon. When I first got to the French islands in the late 80s, I was introduced to a drink called a tea punch. I'd been drinking rum in the other islands, but this tea punch and the Rhum Agricole was a very, very different drink. And it took a few years for me to really begin to grasp and understand what made it so different. First, it's made from fresh sugarcane juice. Now, there's 7 distilleries in Martinique today that make Rhum Agricole. All of them claim to use fresh sugarcane juice, but I can tell you from personal experience in visiting these distilleries over the last 20 years that sometimes cane, especially in the bigger distilleries, the cane comes in the afternoon, it might not get crushed till the next day, and that makes a big difference in the quality of the finished product. Now, certainly it's blended with other production, but things vary from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. The bigger distilleries will buy rum, buy cane from farmers, and when those farmers finish up their day and bring the product into their cut cane into the distillery, it may not be as fresh as anybody would want it to be. Where the smallest distilleries, they go out in the morning, cut the cane, bring it to the distillery, crush it, and everything's done by about 2:30 in the afternoon. One of the rums that I import is called Rhum Neisson, Neisson. Their white rum is bottled at 50% alcohol. All of the distilleries in Martinique bottle their white rum at 50%. Some of them also bottle rums at 55 and 62% alcohol. Neisson also bottles a rum at 70% alcohol. But this rum, bottled at 50% alcohol, is the result of a 3-day fermentation and then careful distillation to about 72% alcohol in a single column copper still. It's an all copper still that was installed at Neisson in the 50s. Neisson dates back to 1932. They started out with a copper pot still and then graduated to a column still sometime in the early 50s. Sections of it have been replaced over the years, but today it's still a modified Saval still, and it's all copper. The yeast that's used at Neisson is a combination of 3 different yeasts that were cultivated as part of a research project from yeasts that were found naturally in the fields around Neisson, from where they cut the cane. There are many different species or many different strains of natural yeast, and part of the research was to identify these different strains and then combine them. What they were looking for is something that would give complete fermentation. It would yeast that were tolerant to higher alcohol so that they would eat all of the available sugar and have a resistance to higher temperatures. The temperature in a fermentation tank in Martinique can get up over 100 degrees because the ambient temperature is over 80 degrees, and fermentation is an exothermic reaction, meaning that as the yeast convert the sugar to alcohol and CO2, it also gives off heat and heats up the fermentation tank. The fermentation tanks, by their design, start a rolling, or it looks like a boiling cauldron. And as the CO2 gas rises, it's like uncorking a bottle of Pepsi-Cola or a Coca-Cola that hasn't been chilled. It starts bubbling, and they get a circulation in the tank. That circulation helps cool the tank, but they also use a little bit of water dripped around the outside of the tank under extreme conditions. But the yeast has to be able to survive over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It has to have complete fermentation. And then the most important aspect of any yeast strain, it has to give you the flavor profile that you're looking for. And Neisson has, for almost over 80 years now, had a very similar, very consistent flavor profile. When I first started visiting Martinique, most of the rum that was sold under the Neisson name was the white rum, and most of it was consumed up in the northwest corner of the island where Neisson is located. The oldest rums were literally the oldest rums in the warehouse, and Gregory's grandfather used to have those bottled as old rum. But the emphasis was on the white rum. That's where most of the sales were. Today that's changed quite a bit. But the white rum is still a preferred white alcohol. It's 100 proof, used in the tea punch, which is a petite punch. It's a little bit of sugarcane syrup and a little bit of lime. I'll talk about more on that later. So this one is not aged. It is rested as part of the AOC regulations. It's rested at least 6 months. The cane season is from roughly 1st of January to the end of June. It extends a little bit further for climatic variations, but most of the distilling is done between the end of January and the 1st of June. When we're into June, we're into the hurricane season, tropical storm season. As you start to get more rain, you get less sugar content, and you can't ferment it. You can't make a good wine out of sugarcane juice wine out of something that doesn't have a high enough sugar content. So during the rum campaign, as they call it, they're busy making rum, and then the rest of the year they work on their aging and bottling. So this is rested a minimum of 6 months. Now the AOC regulation, I believe, is down to 3 months. It has to be rested. It used to be 4 months, but Neisson ages or rests their white rum in stainless steel tanks for at least 6 months. 6 months in those tanks allows the lightest alcohols to evaporate, and it makes for a better product. There are 13 different alcohols that are generated in the fermentation process. So the lightest ones are evaporated off, and in the Martinique culture they call this staling, and it's part of the AOC regulation. Some of that white rum production is put into large tanks, oak tanks, oak vessels that are 1,000 to 2,000 liters. That's up to 500-gallon tanks. Pretty good sized tanks, and these are specially made for Neisson by Sigma Moreau in France. They're Limousin oak, and you can see this has a nice color to it. This is aged 18 months in these French oak vessels. After 18 months it's bottled. Now this is not called aging because the barrels are more than 650 liters, but almost all the distilleries on the island have some kind of amber rum. This one is called Élevé sous bois. Literally means learned under wood. Some of the other names that you might see are Doré or Ambre. There was another one, Pie, that was originally started by the St. James distilleries many years ago. There was an abundance of rum, but a very bad economic year, and they didn't sell a lot of rum. They put it away in large vats, and then a few years later, when the economy improved, but the climate didn't improve, the agriculture was very low yield that year, they started bottling it as rum pie, which means straw colored in English. Many years later, St. James told, as everybody else was using a rum pie, St. James said, hey guys, we trademarked that, you're not allowed to use that. So today, no one uses rum pie, not even St. James. They call their amber rum Ambre. So this one is aged 18 months. It has a heavy wood flavor to it, but unlike most spirits that are aged, it's not aged in charred oak. It's clean, fresh oak, and so there's none of the smokiness that you get from most aged spirits. There's a lot of wood flavor in this, but a lot of raw nut, peanut, pistachio, almond flavor. The French oak tends to give spirits more of an almond flavor, where American white oak tends to give spirits a coconut flavor and a little bit more sweetness than the French oak. Neisson Reserve Special is one of the rums that convinced me to become an importer back in 2003. This one is a aged rum. It wasn't made up until about 1992, something like that. Gregory's grandfather, Gregory Neisson, is the owner, operator of the distillery today. His grandfather passed away. At that time, his mother, Claudine, took it upon herself to improve the aged products. She had spent a lot of time in France working with cognac distillers and winemakers, and used to invite them to her family's plantation, to the Habitation in Martinique during the winter, and she would say, come visit me on the beach in Martinique. That was pretty alluring if you're working in France and the vines are frozen over. You can't do much in France. So they would come to Martinique, and she would take them to the distillery and say, what are we doing wrong? Help me understand what we're doing wrong. After they worked many years on fermentation, Neisson was one of the first distilleries, the first distillery to have all 100% stainless steel fermentation tanks, because Claudine understood that fermentation is very, very crucial to making a good Rhum Agricole or making any good distilled product. You have to start with a good fermented product. This product starts out in French oak barrels for 6 months, and these are barrels of about 200 to 250 liters capacity. 6 months in French oak barrels, then it goes into used bourbon and whiskey barrels for 3 to 6 years. During that time, the barrels are topped off annually, a process they call oulage. Excuse my French if you happen to speak French, but annually they are topped off, and that's in the months between July and about October. By December, they're getting ready for the next harvest. But there's a lot of work that goes into tasting every barrel, blending the barrels, batching the barrels together, and they add a little bit of water and then redistribute the rum back into the barrels and let it age some more. Just before this is bottled, they've gotten the proof down to about 44%, 45% alcohol. Then it goes into used cognac barrels with new heads. So you get a little bit of charred old French wood and some new charred French wood. It's the last 6 months is a finishing time in the aging process, and then this is bottled at 42% alcohol. Every sip of this you will get a new flavor, a new experience, but all of the Neisson rums finish with a fresh sugarcane flavor, and it's almost like being out in the sugarcane fields during harvest. This is a lot of complexity, a lot of almond, a lot of spice notes, but this is the most complex and the most balanced of the aged Martinique rums available today.